listeners, and welcome to a special episode of The Partial Historians. It's just Dr. Rad here tonight, but luckily, filling in for Dr. G, I have the lovely Amy Place visiting, and she's going to tell me all about her exciting research exploits.
Hello.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So please, tell me a little bit about what it is you've been focusing on for the last little while.
So my PhD research looks at clothing and its relationship with identity in late antique Roman North Africa.
Wow,
so,
yeah.
Kind of how people were discussing and using clothing as a means of identity expression and how that relates to sort of wider social concepts and problems and anxieties and things like that. And just the basic using the use of clothing and dress as an important mechanism for identity expression.
Absolutely. So for our listeners who might not be as familiar with the Roman world as you and I,
Sure.
when we say late antique, what are we talking roughly time-wise?
So I'm focusing on about 200 to 550 AD.
Okay. So the last straggling years of the Roman Empire in the...
Yes, that's it. Yes, that's the one.
Awesome. And so when you're looking at Roman Africa, what kind of areas might we sort of equate it to in the modern world, roughly?
It roughly equates to the modern Maghreb region, so predominantly the coastal region, stretching from sort of Libya all the way to Morocco, that kind of area.
Okay.
But a lot of it is the coastal regions that have been excavated or are the most popular points that historians look at.
Yeah. Now, I'm sorry if this is an ignorant question, but do you look at Egypt at all? Is that sort of encompassed in that, or...?
No, I made the decision in the research not to look at Egypt because I feel like it's a special entity unto itself and it deserves its own investigation and it needs its own investigation.
Yes.
And it's got so much a wealth of material that it's for someone else to do. My research excludes that.
Okay, cool. So what drew you to looking at that particular area at this point in time?
Firstly, it's, in my opinion, a bit understudied in terms of clothing.
I know nothing about it.
But it's such a rich area.
Yeah.
And even just when I put together the beginnings of the project, just looking at all the different mosaics that are coming from the region, they're so vibrant and colourful, and they give us such a rich imagining and perception of clothing in this region that I just felt it needed to be looked at. And there was also accompanying this such a rich sort of vocal rhetoric about how dressing practices and sort of censure about clothing, but also good clothing habits coming from very much the Christian authors. That there's such a sort of wealth of information there that it just provides a great context to do this clothing research.
That actually, you raise a really good point. I mean, what kind of source material are you really dealing with here? I gather from what you just said that you're looking at both written sources and also more archaeological kinds of remains.
So a lot of it is very much the literary material and a lot of visual media. I would have liked to look at archaeological remains, but they're very much just in Egypt itself.
Right,
so I'm excluding that region. I've kind of referred to them in sort of passing, but they're not the sort of focus of my research. But the mosaic corpus has provided kind of that visual element that you can sort of relate textual stuff to and sort of access its own source material in itself. Right,
absolutely. So who are your main, are there like particular authors that you're focusing on in your studies?
Yeah, actually my time period of 200 AD coincides very well with the writings of Tertullian, who's quite famous in a couple of his works, in his criticism of female dress in particular. And that's one of the reasons that this sort of area of research, I was drawn into this area of research, is that I kind of felt that he was, in some instances, unfairly criticised for his opinions of women. Some scholars feel he's quite misogynistic in his criticism of women, whereas through my research I've come to kind of understand that he was actually really, maybe in some respects, looking out for the best interests, and he really kind of believed things that he was saying. And it wasn't all just for this kind of patriarchal show. It kind of meant something to him, and he was dealing with real life issues in his own context.
Yeah, so Tertullian, I mean, this is a source I've sort of come across in passing because it's not usually a period or an area that I focus on very much. But Tertullian is one of the earlier sort of Christian writers, isn't he?
Yeah.
And you've sort of alluded to the fact that there might be a bit of a religious element perhaps to what's going on in the period that you're looking at. Yeah. So can you expand a bit more on that?
Yeah, at the time of Tertullian onwards, there is a sort of, as the Christian church is emerging and growing, dress is quite a prominent aspect of the rhetoric that's coming from these authors and from the followers. And although my research hasn't found a Christian uniform as such, they're very much using dress as a means of showing their morality.
Right.
And they're sort of changing their inherited Roman sort of moral scheme and adopting it to their new Christian context. And so this idea of dressing plainly and austerely, which develops into the aesthetic clothing practice, becomes very prominent and becomes a very useful and regular way of showing commitment to this new identity, is especially elites and all elite women, is this decision to wear cheap and plain clothing in place of what you would expect them to wear, something that shows their status. And it very much becomes the thing to do to showcase your dedication to your Christian faith. Interesting,
yeah, because I mean, this is such a turbulent period of the Roman Empire. I mean, in terms of the central politics that's going on. For listeners who are less familiar with this period, as we go into sort of the 200s AD, we're talking about massive upheaval with emperors lasting very short periods of time at various points. In fact, it seems like the empire is almost on the point of collapse on a number of occasions.
Yes, true.
And then, of course, in the early 300s, that's when we've got Constantine I coming in and becoming, notoriously the first Christian emperor. So is all of that sort of playing out a little bit in what you're seeing in Africa, or not so much? It's more just the local...
I think from my research, I've definitely seen what I think of as a growing confidence in Christian identity.
Yes.
So at the beginning of the period, it's very much commitment through persecution and sort of witnessing the faith.
Yes.
But as with Constantine and later emperors and the church becoming an established presence and gaining an authority, clothing practices do become more prominent as a means of expressing this kind of Christian identity, as I said. And I think, with this growing confidence in the Christian faith comes more distinctive clothing stylization of this aesthetic dress practice.
Yes.
And sort of this way of legitimately showing your dedication, whereas in a time where you can't be persecuted and show your ultimate commitment, this kind of use of clothing is a sort of like the next best thing.
Okay, interesting. So when we're talking about this area in Africa, like how many people do you think are Christian, or how much of a swing are we seeing towards Christianity in this area during the period that you're looking at?
I think that's very difficult to say. I don't think it's as clear-cut as we might think of pagan and Christian.
Sure.
I think it's definitely these sort of moulding and melding of environments.
Yes.
And equally, answering that question is also relying a lot on the source material, which shows a very definite bias towards the Christian authors because of later histories. But I think it is becoming a very dominant force in this area. And with all the different issues of schisms and orthodox problems that North Africa experiences in this time, it's definitely a problem that is on is very real to a lot of people, I think, and it's having a real impact in a lot of different environments. Even if the community itself isn't fully Christian, it's filtering into all elements of society.
Yeah, because you're basically saying the period where it's Christianity becoming more of a force, and then gradually becomes the dominant sanctioned religion, and then you're starting to see persecution of sort of pagan cults and pagan faith as you continue on into the period. So it's such a transition to look at that particular period. So you mentioned that Tertullian is quite critical of the way that some women dress. So tell me, what are those young hussies getting around in that's setting him off so?
A lot of Tertullian's rhetoric is basically discussing how these women, either just women or female virgins, are not adhering to dress codes that he deems appropriate.
Okay.
So this might be in the case of Carthaginian virgins, some appear unveiled in the church, which for him is contrary to Pauline doctrine.
Yes.
And for him is very much a no-no.
Yeah.
And in other cases, for sort of the general female population, it's a tendency to ornamentation and elaborate dress, which to him and to others who share his sentiments reflects as immorality or a desire to showcase themselves willingly in public in a way that is not suitable for modest and chaste women.
Yeah. It's kind of interesting because it's, even though I understand that this has obviously got a certain religious element to it for him, it's not really brand new criticism in terms of coming at women for dressing immorally. You know, we've been seeing that kind of thing obviously for a little while in the Roman Empire, with people saying that, you know, women's morals have, you know, slipped down and they're now dressing in these like fancy fabrics that are very sheer and that kind of thing. Is he tapping into the same kinds of criticisms but just slightly adapting it?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that's the reason why he's so successful in his rhetoric, and why he has the opportunity to espouse these kind of ideas, is because they've such an inheritance and they're so rooted in society that he's not saying anything that's super radical to his audience. They're very familiar with these tropes, and even though they might be stereotypes and characterizations which are not 100% accurate or realistic, there's something there culturally that really resonates with his audience, and he can just adapt it ever so slightly for his new Christian context. Absolutely. And it works. And it's something that continues to work for hundreds of years later as well. Yeah,
do we have any idea about how his ideas were received? I mean, is there like response to him in other written works, or?
His ideas are certainly picked up and echoed in Cyprian or Carthage,
right,
which is only a few decades later. But unfortunately, we don't have a female response necessarily to what he's saying, other than the fact that sometimes he reiterates his point in another work, which might suggest that it hasn't quite worked, or he's just kind of reminding them again. That they're still not quite following those dress codes that he so wants them to do.
Get those hemlines a little bit like Yes. Okay, cool. So when you look at the kinds of things that he's talking about in his text, you've alluded to the fact that you do have some visuals in terms of like mosaics and that kind of thing. How do those things match together for you?
Really, they don't in a lot of instances.
Yeah.
And this is one of the things I've had to grapple with in my research, is that on the one hand, you've got this literary discourse, which is all about austere clothing and people dressing in plain attire and not using jewellery.
Yes.
But in other instances, especially in representational arts, they're dressing themselves up to the nines and they want to showcase themselves in the best way possible.
Yes, of course.
And so it's a difficult matter of trying to work out what was actually going on and how far source conventions kind of govern the image that we see from a modern perspective.
Sure.
And most of my mosaic images are elaborate and multicoloured, and there's such a vibrancy in it, which if you were just reading the literary sources, you think it's a very dull world.
Yeah.
Apart from those very few which Tertullian are criticising because they're still not acting how he thinks they should.
Yeah, absolutely. So is there a bit of a class issue here? I mean, who do you think Tertullian is mostly speaking to? Because I mean, I imagine the mosaics are mostly capturing, elite, wealthy, who can afford to make a choice.
Yeah.
Whereas other women, it might not be really a matter of religion or taste, it's just what they can afford.
Yeah. I think there are, definitely class issues at play, and a lot of the later information we have about female dressing practices come from sort of celebratory rhetoric, like Gerontius's Life of Melania the Younger, who is noted because she dresses in this aesthetic clothing, because she sort of refuses the clothing that is most suitable for her, that kind of elite attire.
Right.
She dresses in the clothing of sort of very cheap, and it's sort of very much a lower class thing.
Yes.
But she still regains that sort of element of elite status because she's got the option to choose to do it.
Yes.
And unfortunately, Tertullian is mainly directing himself at the elites and at the sort of upper echelons of society, because these are the people who I think have the option to choose what they wear and to have that sort of ability to showcase their identity. But that's not to say that in the general church and community that people were not reflecting upon sort of his rhetoric in the lower classes. And unfortunately, it's just a lot of the time that these Christian authors are mentioning these elites because that's who their patrons are, and
of course,
they're getting their influence and sort of background from.
Yeah. Do we know much about Tertullian's own background, like where he comes from? Or
he's definitely from the African area.
Yeah.
As far as I have found in my research, he wasn't actually ever part of the clergy.
Right.
He's a very strong theologian and very vocal in sort of defining Christianity as it was in his contemporary context.
Yes.
And he's very a very prominent figure around him, and lots of other later Christian authors do refer back to him, and he's noted for his prominent position.
And do you notice any particular like local trends? Like what's trending in Roman Africa?
It's quite a difficult question to answer, but I think there are definite local customs going on because dress is such an important means of communication that you want it to have local significance because you want to reiterate your local status and your local position. And to do that through dress is certainly a very advantageous thing to do.
Yes.
But again, accessing those slight differences is a bit difficult because of the limited source material. And in some cases, authors will refer to a garment and give no description of what it is. So it's very difficult sometimes to match up terminology with an actual sort of shape or form of a garment. But at the same time, there are some documentary sources like Diocletian's Price Edict that do mention particular types of African clothing.
Right.
So you've got African cloaks or African shirts. And again, we don't know what these differences are, what makes them very different from an Italian version or sort of Britannic version. But there must be something going on for these categories to be employed in this sort of material. But what that is very difficult to say, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I'm just imagining. I mean, I know that your work is not focusing on Egypt, but I know that some of the finest cloth comes from Egypt. You know, so I can only imagine that the people who live close by must have access to potentially really nice fabrics.
Yeah, definitely.
Which might be slightly more affordable because of the
slightly closer. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So. Good for them. So what do you think is probably the most surprising thing that you've discovered during the course of your research?
I think one of the most surprising things is just how much knowledge the general public had about textiles and clothing practices.
Okay, yeah.
And one of the aspects of my research has looked at how sort of textile metaphors or the use of textile terminology filters into other sort of aspects of social life, and in particular sort of how some authors will refer to aspects of the textile production process, and it's just assumed that their audience will understand what this means. And I think in modern society we've kind of lost that familiarity with the processes of making clothing.
Yes.
And so to me that's been a very interesting point, is just how much we've lost knowledge wise, but also how much it's just a factor of everyday life, women being able to spin or weave.
Yes, yeah.
And it's just interesting to think how important clothing was as a necessity.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, you touched on a really interesting point there, because we often focus on women in our podcast, but we're, right at the beginning of the Roman Republic, so we're nowhere near you time-wise nor location-wise, but it's always such an important feature of being a good woman to be able to weave, and even looking at places like Pompeii and Herculaneum, just because of the state of preservation, even with them, there's still so much debate about how much cloth production was actually going on, how much was just like a laundry thing. But it certainly seems to have been a fairly big part of community life. As far as I'm concerned, when I look at the evidence, I'm like, I can kind of see how it is embedded in what they're doing, even if it's just like a laundry or something.
Yeah, I think it is. And these ideas are stereotypes and characterizations precisely because there's that nugget of truth in them, I think.
Yes.
And I think that the average woman, even elite women, have the stereotype of being, surveying their sort of attendants and their slaves and work on weaving or spinning,
Absolutely.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And even though you may not imagine every elite household is carrying out these activities, to a certain extent, I think there's a basis there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been focusing a lot on the ladies, which I do
Yes.
like to do. Do you look at the men at all in your work, or like what's going on with men's clothing, or is it not as much of an issue because of maybe the slight lack of the morality dimension?
It's still a very prominent part of North African rhetoric at this time.
Right.
And even if you look at sort of hunting costumes in North African mosaics,
Yes.
they show a certain trend to being a lot more ornate and a lot more sort of complex. Whether this is what's happening in the clothing practices themselves is a matter of debate, but at least elite men in particular are showing themselves in fashions which, to sort of the late Republic male, were scandalous.
Right.
Long sleeve clothing,
Yeah.
possibly made of sort of elements of silk, that kind of thing.
Ooh la la.
Yeah, so you can imagine a late Roman male being horrified to know that only 300 years later men are going about in these elaborate costumes.
Yeah, absolutely. And so is there like an element of practicality to wearing this as a fabric, or do you think it is for show, like for status and that sort of thing?
I think it really is a status thing.
Yeah.
Because even though the toga continues to be a very symbolic and important garment,
Yes.
it's not very frequently used in representational arts, especially in mosaics.
Okay.
A lot of the time men are choosing to some extent to be shown in tunics, and they become decorated and elaborate. And I think this to a degree reflects reality. And even though we could argue that the toga itself isn't an everyday garment through the whole period, sort of
Oh, for sure, yeah.
Republic and early imperial,
Yeah.
I think it becomes even more of a ceremonial garment in the late antique period.
Well, that probably, I suppose that probably has a little bit to do, as you say, like where we are in the Roman Empire, because in terms of being a citizen, you know, how is that, I suppose, reflected in what you're looking at? I mean, is it you just wear the toga to show off when you're doing something to do with like public office, or you're doing something?
Yeah, I think it's very much a more of an official garment.
Yeah.
I've looked at a couple of images of sort of consuls who or sort of consular activities, and they're wearing the toga as you would expect.
Yes.
Sort of as a sort of a garment of authority, and maybe it's used in some instances to refer back to a time period, a sort of a nostalgic garment, but it's very much not, in my opinion, a common everyday garment.
No,
and
because they're so unwieldy, aren't they?
Yeah, this could be sort of North Africa is very climatically, you know,
it's a bit hotter there.
Yeah, and it would make sense to wear a tunic instead.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it's just a different time period, isn't it? Because by this stage, most people who live in that area are going to be, you know, potentially citizens.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's a bit of a different world to the world where, you know.
Yeah.
Only the elite who actually like are, you know, in Rome and in Italy are considered to be, you know, citizens, which is kind of the period that we're looking at the moment, where it's, you know, very, very early days. But by now we've got, you know, emperors coming from all over the empire. So where you come from is perhaps slightly less of an issue in terms of the role that you can play in the political life. Yeah.
I think as well, because clothing generally shows difference, or it's used to display difference. Once everyone gets citizenship and theoretically access to the toga, it no longer retains that sort of element of differentiation that it once had. And in my opinion, that's why tunic styles become more ornate and developed, is because this is another means of showing difference. It's the fact that you can afford to have a fancy or a very elaborate design.
Yes, absolutely. Now, obviously you've mentioned the climate in Africa. Yeah. Sometimes we get things that are better preserved in this part of the world than in, say, Europe, because it is a bit drier, it's a bit hotter. Dare I say, are there any elements of clothing that have actually been preserved that you've been able to study, or?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay.
There are some fragments from the Fezzan region of North Africa, but this is an area that's outside the influence of the Roman government,
right?
As it's a sort of sub-Saharan landscape,
right? Okay.
Which is again one of the reasons why preservation is a little bit better.
Yes.
And so I've been able to have sort of look at the sort of things that have come from this region, but I don't think they're very typical of the Roman sort of presence in North Africa itself.
Right.
Unfortunately, I would love for there to be an excavation and sort of this wonderful sort of wealth of material to come
I just
from
thought
there.
You never know, do you?
Yeah, it would be wonderful because, part of the problems I've had to deal with is you've got this visual material and you've got this literary evidence, and matching the two together is difficult in itself.
Yeah.
But having sort of physical evidence would also add another layer of interpretation, which would just help sort of answer some of the questions that we have about forms and fashions that we just
Absolutely.
at the moment can only take our best guess at.
Yeah, and do you look at jewellery and that sort of thing at all? Because I imagine that's more likely to survive than...
Yeah. Personally, I haven't had the opportunity to look at it in my research, mainly because there was enough evidence for just dress and clothing in itself.
Sure.
And that even though jewellery is a sort of a very important component of that moralising discourse, of that sort of ornamentation rhetoric or anti-ornamentation rhetoric that is very prominent in the region, that I haven't really been able to study all the different forms and sort of fashions that there are, but there's definitely scope for that research to be done, because I think it is a very important way of differentiating and creating difference in people. And
I imagine, again, I mean, given the area that you're looking at, obviously it's Africa, North Africa in particular, is like famous for having access to things like gold, in larger quantities than in other parts of the Roman Empire.
It's a very rich area as well. So I would imagine this leads to very elaborate displays.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, again, that's the kind of thing that's probably more likely to actually survive for people to look at. But we like to go for the difficult stuff. So I'm afraid we're probably drawing towards a close on our conversation today. But before we go, I was just wondering, Amy, what would you like our listeners to take away about your area of research?
I think just that part of the reason for me doing the research is that I feel like this is quite an understudied area of Roman society, but also one of the sort of aspects of research which is very familiar to us today. I mean, we all make clothing choices in our day-to-day lives, and I think it's a very interesting topic to be able to kind of think back to these sort of processes that we innately do ourselves, and think back to how sort of the average Roman elite woman would dress themselves in sort of 200 AD as well. And so I think it's just a very exciting area of research because it's so familiar yet so foreign at the same time.
Absolutely. And I suppose I should ask you what probably is a question with an obvious answer, but I think it still probably bears putting it on the record. Why is it that this area and this period are so understudied?
I think a lot of the time it's because Italian or sort of Central Roman dress practices have been sort of the main focus of research.
Yeah.
And equally, there are sort of the abundant remains from Coptic textiles, but those are they're studied for their kind of very structural characteristics.
Right.
And less so in terms of their sort of literary discourse and how they fit into the sort of wider rhetoric being created and produced in the region. But I think a lot of the time scholars have had a tendency to think that clothing is a passive material, and that it's suiting a functionality that, for me, I think it far surpasses, and I think it's a much more active material in sort of social processes than scholars have tended to give it credit for.
Well, I suppose especially given the period and the area that you're looking at. I mean, as you've alluded to a number of times, in the Christian tradition, as it evolves, clothing does become such a significant way of indicating what kind of faith you're practicing. I mean, getting to the really extreme people, as you say, like in the ascetic sort of movement where, I mean, you've got people who are literally wandering off into the desert and not being heard or seen of again for decades. So whatever they were wearing, presumably when they left, is what they...
whenever they return,
So, I guess, and obviously the tradition developing in certain strands of Christianity of being very stringent and tough on yourself about, what you allow yourself, not just in clothing, but in many aspects of life. But clothing is a way of visually signifying that to other people. And it's always been obviously a way of advertising who you are, and still is to this day, as you say, with our identities and that sort of thing. So absolutely, I can totally see how we're sort of, very touching the similarities of the people in the past when we look at things like that.
Yeah, it's true.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I'm sure our listeners will be fascinated because we don't often venture, as you say, outside of the usual sort of Italian, Central Europe
to the foreign world.
Oh, no, it's great. It's great. I've learned so much. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Now, one thing I've been very remiss in asking during this whole podcast is whereabouts have you been doing all this fabulous work?
So I'm based at the University of Leicester in the UK, and my research has been funded by a studentship by the Midland 3 Cities Doctoral Training Partnership.
Well, we were very lucky that you were able to stop by Macquarie University, our old alma mater, as you were touring around Australia.